Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. The Macabre Mystery of Elias Mercer, the man who never aged. In the heart of the Ozark Mountains, where shadows dance between ancient oaks and whispers carry on the wind for miles, there exists a tale so unsettling that even today, more than a century later, locals speak of it only in hushed tones. It's the story of a man who defied the very nature of time itself, a man named Elias Mercer, who in 1882 vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that have haunted generations. Picture, if you will, the rugged terrain of the Ozarks in the late 1800s. Mist clings to the hollows like ghostly fingers, and the isolation is so complete that neighbors might live miles apart, connected only by winding dirt paths that seem to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. It was in this landscape of mystery and superstition that villagers began to notice something deeply disturbing about one of their own. Elias Mercer appeared to be a man in his late 20s or early 30s, tall, lean, with piercing dark eyes and thick brown hair that never seemed to show a strand of gray. He was unremarkable in most ways, working occasionally in the local mines, helping farmers during harvest season, and appearing at town gatherings with the quiet demeanor of a man who preferred to observe rather than participate. But there was something about Elias that made people uneasy, something they couldn't quite put their finger on until they began comparing stories and realized it a chilling truth. The man they knew as Elias Mercer in 1882 looked exactly the same as the Elias Mercer their fathers had known in the 1860s, and their grandfathers had spoken of an identical man in the 1840s, not a son or nephew bearing a family resemblance, the very same man, unchanged by the passage of decades. The first whispers began in the general store in what is now known as Mountain Home, Arkansas. Mrs. Abigail Crawford, whose family had lived in the region for 3 generations, was studying a daguerreotype her late father had treasured, a group photograph taken at a church social in 1847. There, standing slightly apart from the other men, was a figure she recognized immediately. The same angular jawline, the same steady gaze, the same slight scar above the left eyebrow. It was Elias Mercer, looking no different than he had when she'd seen him just the week before at the Sunday service. Her voice trembling, Mrs. Crawford showed the photograph to others, and soon a crowd had gathered around the worn image. Old Henrik Johansson, a Norwegian immigrant who'd arrived in the area in 1852, studied the picture with growing alarm. He remembered meeting Elias when he first settled in the region, and the man before him now looked identical to the one in the 35-year-old photograph. The revelation sent ripples of unease through the community. People began digging through old family Bibles, church records, and personal journals, and what they found defied all rational explanation. Again and again, the name Elias Mercer appeared in documents spanning decades, always described as a man of approximately the same age, always bearing the same physical characteristics. To understand the full impact of this discovery, one must appreciate the nature of the Ozark Mountains in 1882. This was a land shaped by hardship and isolation, where communities were bound together by necessity and survival. The terrain itself seemed designed to keep the outside world at bay, rolling hills covered in dense forests, deep hollows where the sun barely penetrated, and limestone caves that honeycomb the region like a vast underground labyrinth. The nearest major city, Springfield, Missouri, lay more than a day's hard ride away. and for most residents, it might as well have been on the other side of the world. News traveled slowly here, carried by peddlers, circuit preachers, and the occasional government official. In such an environment, every face was familiar, every family history was common knowledge, and the arrival or departure of a single person was noted and remembered. The Buffalo River wound its way through the heart of this wilderness, its clear waters reflecting towering bluffs and ancient forest canopies. Along its banks, small settlements had sprung up wherever the land was flat enough for farming or mining. These communities, places with names like Rush, Gilbert, and Ponca, were connected by little more than shared struggles and the oral traditions that passed from one generation to the next. It was this reliance on oral history that made the Elias Mercer mystery so particularly unsettling. In a place where every story was told and retold, where family histories were preserved in the memories of elders who could recite genealogies going back generations, how could a man exist for decades without aging, without anyone noticing until now? The answer lay partly in the very nature of Ozark society. The region attracted those who sought isolation, people running from the law, from debts, from pasts they preferred to forget. Strangers were common enough that one more face in the crowd might not draw immediate attention. But Elias was no stranger. He had been part of these communities for so long that his presence was simply accepted, like the mountains themselves, as word. Of Mrs. Crawford's discovery spread, more evidence began to surface. The local Methodist church in what would later become Eureka Springs possessed a membership registry dating back to 1834. There, in fading ink, was the name Elias Mercer, listed as age 29. 48 years later, the same church's current registry showed Elias Mercer, still listed as age 29. The Baptist congregation in nearby Berryville had similar records. A baptismal certificate from 1841 bore Elias's name, and the description written in the margin matched perfectly with the man known to the current congregation. Even more disturbing was a notation in the church's discipline records from 1856, documenting a complaint against Brother Mercer for his unnatural knowledge of matters that occurred before his apparent birth. The complaint had been dismissed by the church elders, but the record of it remained, and now, in light of recent discoveries, it took on a sinister significance. What had Elias known that so disturbed his fellow congregants? What memories did he possess that belonged to times before he should have existed? Family records proved even more compelling. The Hendricks family, who had farmed the same plot of land since 1829, kept meticulous records in their family Bible. Entries spanning 3 generations mentioned Elias Mercer by name, always as a helpful neighbor, always described in identical terms. Most unsettling of all was an entry from 1851, written in the shaky hand of Grandmother Hendricks. Elias Mercer helped birth the new colt today. Strange how he hasn't aged a day since Papa first met him in 32. Makes one wonder about the nature of time itself. The entry was dated 20 years before the current generation even knew Elias existed, yet it described him with perfect accuracy. How was this possible? Had the Hendricks family somehow conspired to create false records? Multiple men named Elias Mercer coincidentally shared identical appearances? Or was there something far more unsettling at work? As the investigation into Elias's past continued, witness accounts began pouring in from across the region. These weren't vague recollections or half-remembered stories. They were detailed testimonies from people whose integrity was beyond question, people who had interacted with Elias Mercer across spans of time that should have been impossible. Samuel Pritchard, a mine foreman who had worked the lead and zinc deposits near Rush for 25 years, swore that Elias had been one of his most reliable workers from the very beginning of his career. "I first hired him in 1857, Pritchard recalled, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he spoke. He was a young man then, maybe 30 years old, strong as an ox, and twice as smart as most of the boys I had working for me. Here it is, 1882, and he looks exactly the same. Not a gray hair, not a new wrinkle, not even a stoop to his shoulders that you'd expect from a quarter century in the mines. Pritchard's testimony was particularly compelling because of his position. As a foreman, he had been responsible for maintaining detailed work records, and those records showed Elias Mercer employed consistently for 25 years, without any change in his listed age or physical description. The paperwork existed to support Pritchard's claims, forms filled out in different hands by different clerks over the years, all describing the same unchanging man. Mary Elizabeth Garrett, daughter of one of the region's most prominent families, provided perhaps the most chilling testimony of all. Now in her 70s, she could trace her memories of Elias back to her childhood in the 1840s. "I was perhaps 7 years old when I first encountered Mr. Mercer," she recalled, her voice still strong despite her advanced age. "My father was hosting a gathering of local landowners, and Mr. Mercer was there representing some of the mining interests. I remember hiding behind my mother's skirts and peeking out at this handsome man who spoke so knowledgeably about matters of business and politics." She paused, her eyes growing distant as she recalled that long-ago evening. What struck me even then was how he seemed to know things, details about land grants and territorial disputes that had been settled before I was born, before some of the older men present had been born. When questioned about his knowledge, he would simply smile and say he had a good memory for history. Mrs. Garrett's testimony continued with increasing unease. Over the decades, I would encounter Mr. Mercer at various social functions and community gatherings. Each time, he looked exactly as he had when I was a child. As I grew from a girl to a young woman to a wife and mother, as my hair turned gray and my face showed the passage of years, Elias Mercer remained unchanged. It was as if time simply had no claim on him. Perhaps most disturbing was her final recollection. At my father's funeral in 1878, Mr. Mercer approached me to offer his condolences. I thanked him, and then, on an impulse I still don't understand, I asked him if he remembered me as a little girl hiding behind my mother's skirts. He smiled, that same gentle smile I remembered from childhood, and said, "Of course, Mary Elizabeth. You were wearing a blue dress with white ribbons, and you were fascinated by my pocket watch." I nearly fainted, for his description was perfectly accurate, down to details I had forgotten myself until that moment. The accumulating testimony painted a picture that defied rational explanation. Here was a man who had been a constant presence in the community for decades, yet who showed no signs of aging. More than that, he possessed memories and knowledge that seemed to span far more years than any normal human lifespan could account for. Dr. Josiah Blackwood, one of the few college-educated men in the region, had been serving as the local physician for 15 years when the Elias Mercer mystery came to light. His professional opinion was sought by many in the community, and his response was both measured and deeply unsettling. "I have examined Mr. Mercer on several occasions over the years," Dr. Blackwood stated in a letter that still survives in the Arkansas State Archives. "In every instance, his physical condition has been that of a man in his late 20s or early 30s. His reflexes, his muscle tone, his cardiovascular condition, all consistent with a young adult in prime physical condition." Dr. Blackwood's letter continued with clinical precision. "What disturbs me most profoundly is not just the apparent lack of aging, but the complete absence of any signs that aging has been arrested or reversed. There are no indicators of medical intervention, no unusual medications or treatments. He appears to exist in a state of perfect physical stasis, as if he were somehow exempt from the biological processes that govern the rest of humanity." The physician's scientific mind struggled with the implications of his observations. I have consulted with colleagues in Little Rock and St. Louis, sharing my observations without revealing the subject's identity. None can offer any medical explanation for such a condition. We are faced with something that challenges our fundamental understanding of human biology. As word of the Elias Mercer mystery spread beyond the immediate community, it began to attract attention from unexpected quarters. William Rockhill Nelson, the influential editor and publisher of the Kansas City Star, was known for his interest in unusual stories from rural Missouri and Arkansas. In the summer of 1882, he received a letter from a correspondent in the Ozarks describing the strange case of the man who never aged. Nelson, a shrewd journalist with an eye for stories that would captivate his readers, dispatched one of his most trusted reporters to investigate. The resulting article, published in August 1882, brought the Elias Mercer story to a much wider audience and added considerable credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as rural superstition. The Kansas City Star reporter, identified only as J.M. in the newspaper's records, spent 2 weeks in the Ozarks interviewing witnesses and examining evidence. His report, published under the headline "The Unchanging Man of the Mountains," documented the case with journalistic rigor that was unusual for the sensationalist press of the era. This correspondent, the article began, came to the Arkansas mountains expecting to debunk another tale of frontier mythology. Instead, I find myself confronted with testimony and evidence that challenges the very foundations of natural law. If the dozens of witnesses I have interviewed are to be believed, and I can find no reason to doubt their honesty, then Elias Mercer represents a phenomenon that science cannot yet explain. The article went on to detail many of the same testimonies and evidence that had convinced the local population, but with the added weight of external validation. Here was a representative of one of the region's most respected newspapers, confirming that the story was not merely local folklore, but something worthy of serious consideration. Perhaps most significantly, the Kansas City Star article included the first known attempt to photograph Elias Mercer. The reporter had brought with him one of the new portable cameras that were becoming increasingly common among professional journalists. The resulting photograph, reproduced in the newspaper, showed a man who matched perfectly the descriptions provided by witnesses. A figure of apparent youth and vitality who seemed to radiate an indefinable sense of otherness. But it was the comparison with historical photographs that provided the most compelling divide. Hence, the article included reproductions of daguerreotypes dating back to the 1840s, and the resemblance between the figure in those images and the man photographed in 1882 was undeniable. Even allowing for the limitations of early photographic technology, the facial structure, the bearing, even the expression remained constant across 4 decades. The Kansas City Star article concluded with a statement that would prove prophetic. Whether Elias Mercer is the beneficiary of some unknown medical condition, the subject of an elaborate hoax, or something far more mysterious, his story deserves serious investigation. This correspondent has the unsettling feeling that we have encountered something that will challenge our understanding of human nature itself. As the story gained wider circulation, theories about Elias Mercer began to proliferate. Some of these theories were grounded in the limited scientific knowledge of the day, while others drew upon the rich folklore and superstition of the Ozark region. All of them attempted to explain the unexplainable, to find rational answers for a phenomenon that seemed to defy rationality. The medical theories were perhaps the most prosaic, though no less unsettling for their scientific veneer. Dr. Matthias Strobel, a physician and researcher from St. Louis, proposed that Elias might be suffering from a rare glandular condition that arrested the aging process. Such conditions were virtually unknown to medical science at the time. But Dr. Strobel argued that the human body still held many secrets that future research might unlock. We are only beginning to understand the complex interplay of hormones and biological processes that govern human development, Dr. Strobel wrote in a letter to the St. Louis Medical Journal. It is conceivable that some individuals might possess genetic anomalies that dramatically slow or halt the aging process. While such a condition would be unprecedented, it is not necessarily impossible. However, Dr. Strobel's theory failed to account for the most disturbing aspects of the Elias Mercer case. Not just the apparent lack of aging, but the man's possession of memories and knowledge spanning far more years than even an arrested aging process could explain. How could a man in his 30s, even one who aged slowly, possess detailed knowledge of events that had occurred decades before his apparent birth? Other medical professionals proposed even more exotic explanations. Dr. Cornelius Vanderhilt, a researcher interested in the emerging field of psychology, suggested that Elias might be suffering from a form of collective delusion, that the man himself was perfectly normal, but that some unknown psychological phenomenon was causing entire communities to misremember and misperceive his age and history. This theory, too, had significant flaws. It required not just individual delusion, but mass hallucination on a scale that had never been documented. Moreover, it failed to account for the physical evidence, the photographs, the written records, the documented testimonies that could be independently verified. As scientific explanations proved inadequate, many in the community turned to the rich folklore of the Ozark Mountains for answers. The region had always been a place where the supernatural seemed to lurk just beyond the edge of everyday experience, where old beliefs and ancient superstitions coexisted with Christian faith and modern skepticism. The Ozarks were home to countless legends of beings that existed outside the normal flow of time. Cherokee traditions, preserved in the memories of those few Native Americans who still lived in the region, spoke of time walkers, individuals who had been cursed or blessed to exist in multiple periods simultaneously. These beings were said to appear human, but to possess knowledge and memories spanning centuries. European folklore, brought to the region by settlers from Ireland, Scotland, and Germany, included similar concepts. The Irish spoke of the Aos, supernatural beings who could take human form and live among mortals for extended periods without aging. German traditions included tales of individuals who had made bargains with supernatural forces in exchange for extended life. Perhaps most relevant to the Elias Mercer case were the specifically Ozark traditions of haint men, individuals who had somehow become trapped between life and death, doomed to wander the earth in a state of neither full life nor complete death. These beings were said to appear normal to casual observation, but to possess an otherworldly quality that made them unsettling to be around for extended periods. Local folklore also included stories of individuals who had discovered springs or caves with supernatural properties. The Ozarks were riddled with underground water sources, many of which were attributed magical or healing properties by the indigenous population. Could Elias have discovered some source of eternal youth hidden in the labyrinthine cave systems that honeycombed the region? The religious community was divided in its response to the Elias Mercer mystery. Some saw it as evidence of divine intervention. Perhaps Elias was a modern-day Methuselah, blessed by God with extended life for some higher purpose. Others viewed it with deep suspicion, seeing in Elias's unchanging nature something fundamentally unnatural and potentially malevolent. Reverend Cornelius Macready of the Berryville Baptist Church delivered a series of sermons in the fall of 1882, addressing what he called the question of Elias. His position was that any deviation from natural law represented either divine miracle or demonic intervention, and that the community had a responsibility to determine which they were dealing with. "We are faced Reverend Macready proclaimed from his pulpit, with something that challenges our understanding of God's natural order. Either we are witnessing a miracle of divine preservation, or we are confronted with something far more sinister. And our duty as Christians is to discern the truth and act accordingly. Macready's sermons drew large crowds from across the region, and his theological arguments added another layer of complexity to the growing controversy surrounding Elias Mercer. If divine intervention could explain Elias's condition, what purpose did God have in preserving him? What message was meant to be conveyed through his existence? Conversely, if supernatural malevolence was at work, what threat did Elias pose to the community? Was his presence a test of faith, or was he something far more dangerous masquerading as a harmless neighbor? These questions became more pressing as reports began to surface of Elias's seemingly supernatural knowledge. Farmers reported that he possessed detailed information about weather patterns and agricultural conditions going back generations. He could predict with uncanny accuracy which fields would be most productive in any given year, which crops would thrive or fail, and when severe weather was approaching. More disturbing still were reports that Elias possessed knowledge of future events. Several witnesses claimed that he had warned them of accidents or misfortunes that subsequently came to pass exactly as he had predicted. Mrs. Charlotte Williamson reported that Elias had advised her to keep her children away from the old mill pond on a specific date in July, saying only that the water would be dangerous that day. When she followed his advice, she later learned that another child had nearly drowned in the pond on that very date when the mill dam had partially collapsed. Such incidents, while not definitive proof of supernatural ability, created an atmosphere of unease around Elias that grew stronger as time passed. People began to avoid him, to speak in whispers when he was near, to cross themselves when he passed by. The man who had once been simply a remarkable member of the community was becoming an object of fear and suspicion. Yet those who knew Elias best insisted that he remained unchanged in temperament as well as appearance. He was still quiet, helpful, and kind. He showed no signs of malevolence or supernatural power beyond his apparent immunity to aging. If anything, he seemed increasingly sad as the community's attitude toward him shifted from acceptance to fear. It was during this period of growing tension that encounters with outsiders became particularly significant. The isolation of the Ozark communities meant that visitors were rare and memorable, and their testimonies carried special weight because they had no reason to participate in any local conspiracy or delusion. In September 1882, a traveling photographer named Theodore Eastman arrived in the region from Memphis, Tennessee. Eastman was part of a growing movement of professional photographers who traveled the frontier documenting life in remote communities. He had heard rumors of the unusual story surrounding Elias Mercer and hoped to add to his collection of curiosities of the American frontier. Eastman spent 3 weeks in the area, interviewing witnesses and examining evidence. His professional expertise in photography made him particularly valuable in analyzing the historical images that formed such a crucial part of the case. After careful study of daguerreotypes dating back to the 1840s, Eastman concluded that they showed the same individual photographed across a span of 4 decades. In my professional opinion, Eastman wrote in a report he later published in the Memphis Commercial Appeal, these photographs show not a series of related individuals, but the same man captured at different times across an impossible span of years. The bone structure, the facial proportions, even subtle details like the pattern of small scars and blemishes remain constant. Either we are dealing with the most elaborate photographic acts in history, or we have documented evidence of something that challenges our understanding of human nature. Eastman's photographs of Elias, taken with the most advanced equipment available in 1882, would later become some of the most studied images in early American photography. They showed a man of apparent youth and vitality, but with eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience far beyond his apparent years. Perhaps even more compelling was the testimony of James Morrison, a Union Army veteran who had served in Missouri during the Civil War. Morrison was passing through the region in late 1882 when he encountered Elias at a general store in what is now known as Mountain View. The meeting left Morrison deeply shaken. "I knew that man," Morrison later wrote to his brother in Illinois. "I met him in 1864 during the Battle of Pilot Knob. He was serving as a guide for our forces, helping us navigate the Ozark terrain. I remember him distinctly because he seemed to know every trail, every cave, every spring in a 100-mile radius. It was as if he had lived in those mountains his entire life." Morrison's letter continued with growing unease. "The man I met last week looked exactly, and I mean exactly, as he did 18 years ago, not older, not changed, not weathered by the passage of time. When I approached him and asked if he remembered our meeting during the war, he smiled sadly and said, 'I remember many things, Mr. Morrison, perhaps too many.' The way he said it sent chills down my spine." The veteran's testimony was particularly significant because it placed Elias in documented historical events. Morrison's military records, preserved in the National Archives, included references to civilian guides who had assisted Union forces in the Missouri campaign. While Elias was not mentioned by name, the records confirmed that local guides had been extensively used during the period Morrison described. Railroad workers provided another source of outside testimony. The construction of the Missouri Pacific Railroad through the Ozark region in the 1870s had brought hundreds of workers into contact with local residents, including Elias Mercer. Several of these workers, interviewed years later when the mystery came to light, recalled encounters with a man matching Elias's description. Frank O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who had worked on railroad construction from 1873 to 1876, remembered Elias as an unofficial liaison between the railroad company and local landowners. "He seemed to know every property line, every easement, every legal complication we might encounter," O'Sullivan recalled. "What struck me was how he could settle disputes between the railroad and local farmers just by talking to them. It was as if he knew their families, their histories, their concerns better than they knew them themselves." O'Sullivan's testimony included a detail that would prove significant. "Elias once told me that he had seen the railroad coming years before the first survey crews arrived. He said he had been watching the progress of rail lines across Missouri and Arkansas and knew they would eventually reach his part of the mountains. When I asked how he could have known such a thing, he just smiled and said he was good at seeing patterns." As these testimonies accumulated, they painted a picture of a man whose knowledge and memories seemed to span far more years than any normal human lifetime could account for. Yet they also revealed someone who was deeply embedded in the community, who cared about its welfare, and who used his mysterious knowledge to help rather than harm. This contradictory nature, supernatural yet benevolent, mysterious yet helpful, made Elias Mercer a figure of fascination rather than simple fear. But as the attention surrounding him intensified, and as the community struggled to understand what he represented, the stage was being set for events that would lead to his mysterious disappearance. The autumn of 1882 brought an unusually harsh early winter to the Ozark Mountains. Snow fell in October, and temperatures dropped well below normal for the season. Crops failed, livestock suffered, and the already difficult life of the mountain communities became even more challenging. In such times of hardship, people naturally looked for someone to blame, and increasingly, that blame fell upon Elias Mercer. Superstition ran deep in the isolated communities of the Ozarks, and many began to see Elias's supernatural nature as somehow connected to their misfortunes. If he was indeed something other than human, perhaps his presence was bringing a curse upon the land. Old wives' tales spoke of supernatural beings whose very existence could disrupt the natural order, bringing bad weather, crop failures, and disease. Reverend Macready's earlier sermons took on new significance as the community's situation worsened. If Elias was indeed a supernatural being, and if his presence was somehow responsible for their hardships, then perhaps action needed to be taken. The Reverend began to preach more explicitly about the community's duty to protect itself from supernatural threats. "We cannot allow our Christian community to be corrupted by forces we do not understand," Macready declared from his pulpit. "If there is something among us that is not of God, then we must take whatever steps are necessary to preserve our souls and our way of life." These sentiments found fertile ground in a population that was already struggling with economic hardship and social upheaval. The late 19th century was a time of rapid change in America, and rural communities like those in the Ozarks often felt left behind by progress. The presence of someone like Elias Mercer, unchanging while everything else transformed around him, became a symbol of all that seemed wrong with their world. By November 1882, small groups of men had begun meeting in secret, discussing what should be done about the Elias problem. These meetings were informal at first, fueled by whiskey and frustration, but they gradually took on a more organized character as winter deepened and conditions worsened. The leader of these groups was a man named Jeremiah Hawkins, a farmer and part-time preacher who claimed to have received divine visions about the threat posed by Elias Mercer. Hawkins declared that he had been chosen by God to rid the community of supernatural corruption, and he began to recruit followers who shared his conviction that drastic action was necessary. "The Lord has shown me in dreams and visions," Hawkins proclaimed to his growing band of followers, "that this creature calling himself Elias Mercer is an abomination before God. His unnatural existence is a stain upon our Christian community, and we are called to cleanse that stain before it spreads further." Hawkins's rhetoric grew increasingly inflammatory as his movement gained momentum. He spoke of Elias as a demon in human form, as an agent of Satan sent to test and corrupt the faithful. He claimed that Elias's apparent kindness and helpfulness were merely disguises for a deeper malevolence that would eventually reveal itself unless preventive action was taken. Meanwhile, Elias himself seemed increasingly aware of the growing hostility toward him. Those few community members who still interacted with him reported that he appeared sadder and more withdrawn than ever before. He continued to go about his daily activities, but with a sense of resignation that suggested he knew his time in the community was coming to an end. Mary Elizabeth Garrett, who had known Elias for decades, made one final attempt to understand his true nature. In a conversation she later recounted to her diary, she asked him directly about his apparent immunity to aging. His response, as she recorded it, was both enlightening and deeply unsettling. "He looked at me with those eyes that seemed to hold so much sorrow," she wrote, and said, "Mrs. Garrett, there are some gifts that come with a price higher than anyone should have to pay. I have lived longer than any man should live, seen more than any soul should see, and carried burdens that grow heavier with each passing year. If I could trade this existence for a normal life and a peaceful death, I would do so gladly." When she pressed him about his origins and the source of his condition, he became even more enigmatic. "I cannot say whether I am blessed or cursed, whether I am meant to serve some higher purpose, or whether I am simply the victim of forces beyond my understanding. All I know is that I have tried to use whatever time I have been given to help others, to make the world a little better than I found it. If that is not enough, then perhaps it is time for me to seek a different path. Mrs. Garrett's diary entry, discovered many years later among her personal effects, provides perhaps the most intimate glimpse we have of Elias Mercer's inner state during his final weeks in the community. It reveals a man, or being, struggling with the weight of an existence that had stretched far beyond normal human experience, yet still committed to principles of kindness and service, even in the face of growing hostility. As November gave way to December, the tension in the community reached a breaking point. Jeremiah Hawkins's group had grown to include more than 24 men, and they had begun making specific plans for confronting Elias Mercer. Their intention was to force him to confess his true nature and then to drive him from the community, or worse, if he proved to be the supernatural threat they believed him to be. The confrontation was planned for 1882, a date that would live in local memory as the night when the mystery of Elias Mercer reached its climax. But when Hawkins and his followers arrived at the small cabin where Elias had been living, they found it empty. The man who had been the center of their fears and obsessions had vanished without a trace. The cabin showed no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Elias's few possessions remained undisturbed. His bed was neatly made, and there was even a meal prepared on the table, as if he had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return. But Elias Mercer was gone, and despite extensive searches over the following days and weeks, no trace of him was ever found. Some said they had seen him walking toward Blanchard Springs Caverns on the evening of December 14th, moving with purpose, but without apparent haste. The caverns, a vast underground system that had been only partially explored, seemed a fitting place for someone seeking to disappear completely. Search parties explored the accessible portions of the cave system, but found no sign of Elias or any indication of where he might have gone. Others claimed to have spotted him heading north toward the Buffalo River, perhaps seeking passage out of the region entirely. But no ferryman or boat operator reported carrying a passenger matching his description, and no tracks were found along the riverbank, despite optimal conditions for tracking. The most unsettling theory was that Elias had simply walked into the wilderness and allowed himself to be consumed by it. The Ozark Mountains contained thousands of acres of unexplored territory, deep hollows where a man could disappear completely, caves and crevices where a body might lie undiscovered for centuries. If Elias had chosen to end his unnatural existence, the mountains would have provided countless opportunities to do so. But there were also those who whispered that Elias had not died at all, that his disappearance was simply another manifestation of his supernatural nature. Perhaps he had tired of the community's suspicion and hostility and had chosen to move on to some other place, some other identity, some other chance at finding peace in a world that could not accept what he was. The disappearance of Elias Mercer left the community of the Ozark Mountains forever changed. The men who had planned to confront him found themselves dealing with a mixture of relief and unease. They had been prepared for a supernatural battle, for dramatic revelations, for the validation of their fears and suspicions. Instead, they faced only emptiness and unanswered questions. Jeremiah Hawkins, the leader of the group that had planned the confrontation, was particularly affected by Elias's disappearance. He had built his entire movement around the need to confront a supernatural threat. And when that threat simply vanished, he was left without purpose or direction. Some said that Hawkins never recovered from the anticlimax, that he spent the rest of his life wondering whether he had been a righteous crusader or simply a man consumed by paranoia and hatred. The immediate aftermath of Elias's disappearance was marked by a strange mixture of relief and regret. Those who had feared him were glad to see the source of their unease removed, but many others began to realize what they had lost. Elias had been a helper, a problem solver, someone who could be counted on in times of need. His absence left a void that was felt in dozens of small ways throughout the community. Farmers who had relied on his knowledge of weather patterns and soil conditions found themselves struggling to make decisions about planting and harvesting. Miners who had depended on his expertise in navigating the underground tunnel systems discovered that their work became more dangerous and less productive. Even simple community gatherings seemed diminished by the absence of his quiet, steadying presence. But perhaps most unsettling was the gradual realization that Elias's warnings and predictions had been consistently accurate. In the months following his disappearance, several of the future events he had cryptically warned about came to pass exactly as he had suggested they would. A bridge he had advised against using collapsed during a spring flood. A mine shaft he had recommended sealing suffered a catastrophic cave-in. Weather patterns unfolded precisely as he had predicted they would. These posthumous validations of Elias's supernatural knowledge left the community deeply unsettled. If he had possessed genuine prophetic abilities, what did his disappearance mean for their future? Had they driven away someone who might have continued to protect and guide them? Or had his departure been necessary to prevent some greater catastrophe that his continued presence might have caused? As news of Elias Mercer's disappearance spread beyond the immediate community, it attracted attention from journalists, researchers, and curiosity seekers from across the region. The Kansas City Star, which had first brought the story to wider public attention, dispatched reporters to investigate the circumstances of his vanishing. Their articles, published throughout 1883, helped to cement the Elias Mercer case in the popular imagination as one of the great unsolved mysteries of the American frontier. The St. Louis Republic sent a team of investigators that included both journalists and a representative from the Smithsonian Institution who was interested in documenting unusual folklore and legends. Their comprehensive report, published as a series of articles in early 1883, provided the most detailed documentation of the case that had yet appeared in print. These investigations turned up additional evidence that had been overlooked during the initial discovery of Elias's unusual nature. Arch records from as far away as Little Rock and Fort Smith contained references to a man matching his description dating back to the 1820s. Court documents from territorial Arkansas included testimony from someone named Elias Mercer in land disputes that had occurred decades before the current mystery began. Perhaps most significantly, researchers discovered that similar stories existed in other parts of the Arkansas and Missouri mountains. References to individuals who did not age, who possessed unusual knowledge, and who eventually disappeared under mysterious circumstances appeared in the oral traditions of communities hundreds of miles apart. These stories suggested that Elias Mercer might not have been unique, that there might be others like him scattered throughout the frontier regions of America. The investigation also revealed attempts by local authorities to suppress information about the case. Several church and government records had been deliberately altered or destroyed, apparently in an effort to eliminate evidence of Elias's extended presence in the community. These acts of suppression suggested that at least some members of the community had been aware of his unusual nature for far longer than the general population realized. Why had these records been suppressed? Were there individuals who had known the truth about Elias Mercer, but had chosen to protect him from exposure? Or were there darker reasons for wanting to hide evidence of his existence, fears that his story might attract unwanted attention, or that knowledge of his true nature might prove dangerous to the community? The suppression of records became a controversy in its own right, with some community members demanding answers about who had been responsible for the cover-up and why it had been deemed necessary. But those who might have provided answers, church elders, local officials, longtime residents who had been adults when Elias first appeared in the community, either refused to speak or claimed to have no knowledge of any deliberate suppression. As the initial wave of outside attention subsided, the community began the difficult process of returning to normal life. But normal life proved elusive when the very foundations of reality had been called into question. The Elias Mercer case had challenged basic assumptions about human nature, about the passage of time, about the boundaries between natural and supernatural. Some residents left the area entirely, unable to cope with the unresolved questions and lingering unease. Others threw themselves into religious fervor, seeking answers in scripture and prayer that logic and investigation had failed to provide. Still others retreated into denial, convincing themselves that the entire episode had been the result of mass hysteria or collective delusion. But there were also those who found in the mystery a reason for deeper contemplation about the nature of existence itself. If someone like Elias Mercer could exist, whether through natural anomaly, supernatural intervention, or some combination of both, what did that say about the universe and humanity's place within it? Were there aspects of reality that science and religion had yet to discover? Were there individuals walking among ordinary people who possessed abilities or characteristics that defied conventional understanding? These philosophical questions would continue to resonate long after the immediate excitement of the mystery had faded. The Elias Mercer case had opened doorways of possibility that could never quite be closed again, had suggested that the world might be far stranger and more complex than anyone had previously imagined. By the mid-1880s, the immediate memory of Elias Mercer was beginning to fade from daily consciousness, but his story was becoming embedded in the folklore and oral tradition of the Ozark Mountains. Parents told their children about the man who never aged. Travelers repeated the tale at inns and taverns, and gradually the historical figure began to transform into something approaching legend. This transformation was both inevitable and troubling. As the story passed from person to person, details changed, facts became embellished, and the careful documentation that had marked the original investigations gave way to the more fluid nature of folk narrative. Some versions of the story made Elias into a heroic figure, a mysterious protector who watched over the mountain communities. Others cast him as a more sinister presence, a supernatural threat that had been driven away by the courage and faith of righteous people. But even as the story evolved and changed, certain core elements remained constant. Elias Mercer had been a real person who had lived among the mountain communities for decades without aging. He had possessed knowledge and abilities that could not be easily explained, and he had disappeared under circumstances that left more questions than answers. The persistence of these core elements, even as other details shifted and changed, suggested that the story retained a connection to actual events. Unlike purely fictional legends, the Elias Mercer tale carried within it the weight of documented evidence and eyewitness testimony that could not be entirely dismissed or explained away. As the 19th century drew to a close, new reports began to surface from across the Ozark region. Hunters claimed to have encountered a man matching Elias's description in remote areas of the mountains. Travelers reported meeting someone who seemed familiar, but who disappeared before he could be approached or questioned. These sightings were sporadic and could not be verified, but they kept alive the possibility that Elias Mercer had not died, but had simply chosen to live in isolation, away from human communities. The reported sightings followed a consistent pattern. The figure was always seen at a distance, always alone, always in areas where human presence was rare. When approached, he would vanish into the forest with an ease that suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain. Those who claimed to have seen him described a man who still appeared young and vigorous, unchanged from the descriptions that had been recorded during his time in the community. Whether these sightings represented genuine encounters with Elias Mercer, cases of mistaken identity, or the power of suggestion acting upon people who knew his story, they served to keep his memory alive and to fuel speculation about his ultimate fate. They also contributed to a growing body of Ozark folklore that portrayed the mountains as a place where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were unusually thin. The turn of the 20th century brought new interest in the Elias Mercer case from an unexpected quarter: the emerging field of anthropology. Researchers who were studying American folklore and legend began to examine the story as an example of how real events could be transformed into mythic narratives. Their work helped to preserve many of the original documents and testimonies that might otherwise have been lost to time. Professor James Moorhead of the University of Arkansas conducted the most comprehensive academic study of the case, interviewing surviving witnesses and examining all available documentation. His monograph, The Unchanging Man, a Study in Ozark Folklore and Reality, published in 1903, remains the definitive scholarly treatment of the Elias Mercer mystery. Moorhead's conclusion was necessarily ambiguous. While he could find no evidence of deliberate fraud or hoax, he also could not provide any rational explanation for the phenomena described by witnesses. "We are confronted," he wrote, "with a case that challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature and the laws of biology. Either we must accept that our understanding of these laws is incomplete, or we must conclude that an entire community was subject to a form of mass delusion unprecedented in psychological literature." The professor's inability to reach a definitive conclusion reflected the broader challenge posed by the Elias Mercer case. It was a mystery that resisted simple explanation, that forced those who encountered it to grapple with questions about the nature of reality itself. As the 20th century progressed, the immediate memory of Elias Mercer continued to fade, but his story became deeply embedded in the cultural identity of the Ozark region. Local historians made efforts to preserve the documentary evidence of his existence, while storytellers and folklorists ensured that his tale would be passed down to future generations. The famous folklorist Vance Randolph, who spent decades collecting Ozark stories and traditions, encountered numerous references to Elias Mercer during his research. While Randolph never published a comprehensive account of the case, perhaps because it was too well documented to fit comfortably into his collections of folklore, his notes and correspondence reveal his fascination with the story and his belief that it represented something genuinely anomalous. In a letter to a colleague, Randolph wrote, "The Elias Mercer case troubles me because it appears to be both thoroughly documented and utterly impossible. I have interviewed people who knew him personally, examined photographs and written records, and found no evidence of fraud or deception. Yet the implications of accepting the story at face value are staggering. If Elias Mercer was indeed what the evidence suggests he was, then we must reconsider our most basic assumptions about human nature." Randolph's uncertainty reflected the position of many researchers who encountered the case. The evidence was compelling, but the implications were so far-reaching that acceptance required a fundamental re-evaluation of reality itself. Modern researchers have continued to grapple with the Elias Mercer mystery, applying new technologies and methodologies to the surviving evidence. Photographic analysis using computer enhancement techniques has confirmed that the images purporting to show Elias across multiple decades do indeed appear to show the same individual. Handwriting analysis of documents bearing his signature has revealed consistent patterns across a span of years that would normally show significant changes due to aging. Carbon dating of some of the documents has confirmed their age, ruling out the possibility that they were created after the fact to support a hoax. Genealogical research has failed to find any evidence of a family line that might explain the appearance of multiple individuals with identical names and characteristics. Yet despite these technological advances, the fundamental mystery remains unsolved. Science has neither provided a rational explanation for Elias Mercer's apparent immunity to aging, nor definitively proven that the documented evidence is fraudulent. The case has attracted attention from researchers interested in longevity and aging, who wonder whether Elias might have possessed some genetic anomaly that could hold clues to extending human lifespan. It has also drawn interest from parapsychologists and researchers into anomalous phenomena who see in his story evidence that reality might be far stranger than conventional science admits. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Elias Mercer case has been its influence on how we think about the nature of human existence itself. His story forces us to confront fundamental questions about identity, mortality, and the passage of time. If someone like Elias could exist, whether through natural means or supernatural intervention, what does that tell us about the human condition? The mystery of Elias Mercer also raises troubling questions about how society responds to those who are different, who challenge our understanding of normalcy. The fear and suspicion that ultimately drove him from the community reflect deeper anxieties about otherness and the unknown. In seeking to protect themselves from what they did not understand, the people of the Ozark Mountains may have driven away something remarkable and valuable. As we reflect on the story of Elias Mercer more than a century after his disappearance, we are left with more questions than answers. Was he a man blessed or cursed with supernatural longevity? Was he the product of some unknown medical condition that arrested the aging process? Was he something else entirely, a being from another time or place who had somehow found himself living among ordinary humans? The truth may never be known. The physical evidence, while compelling, is not conclusive. The testimony of witnesses, while consistent, cannot be independently verified. The mystery remains as impenetrable today as it was in 1882. But perhaps the enduring power of the Elias Mercer story lies not in finding definitive answers, but in confronting the questions it raises. His tale reminds us that the world is full of mysteries that defy easy explanation, that reality might be far more complex and strange than we dare to imagine. In the deep hollows and ancient forests of the Ozark Mountains, where shadows dance between the trees and the wind carries whispers of things long forgotten, the story of Elias Mercer lives on. Whether he was man, myth, or something in between, his legacy continues to challenge our understanding of what it means to be man, what it means to exist in time, and what secrets the world might still hold for those brave enough to seek them. And so we are left to wonder, if Elias Mercer never truly aged, if time had no claim upon him, then perhaps death had no claim either. Maybe, in some remote corner of the Arkansas mountains, where the mist clings to the hollows and the forests keep their ancient secrets, a figure still walks, unchanged, timeless, carrying within himself the weight of memories that span not just decades, but centuries. The thought is both thrilling and terrifying. In a world where everything changes, where nothing lasts forever, where time claims all things in the end, the possibility that someone might exist outside these laws offers both hope and horror. Hope, because it suggests that mortality might not be absolute, that there might be escape from the relentless march of time. Horror, because it implies a form of existence that might be more curse than blessing, a lifetime stretched beyond all natural limits, filled with the accumulated sorrow of watching everything and everyone you care about fade away while you remain unchanged. Perhaps that is the true tragedy of Elias Mercer. Not that he possessed some supernatural gift, but that this gift came at a price too terrible to contemplate. To live forever while surrounded by mortality, to accumulate memories and experiences that no human mind was meant to contain, to watch generation after generation pass away while remaining trapped in the same unchanging form. such an existence might indeed be more punishment than privilege. If Elias Mercer still walks the Ozark Mountains, as some believe he does, then he carries within himself not just the mystery of his own nature, but the weight of all human longing for permanence in a world of constant change. He represents both our deepest dreams and our darkest fears about the nature of existence itself. The story of Elias Mercer, the man who never aged, stands as a testament to the enduring power of mystery in human life. In an age when science seems poised to explain everything, when technology promises to unlock all secrets, his tale reminds us that some questions may forever remain unanswered. Some mysteries may be too profound for human understanding to fully grasp. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, to serve as reminders that reality is far more complex and wonderful than we can ever fully comprehend. The story of Elias Mercer, whether true or false, real or imagined, continues to capture our imagination because it speaks to something deep within the human spirit. Our desire to transcend the limitations of mortality, while simultaneously fearing what such transcendence might cost. In the end, the mystery of Elias Mercer is not just about one man's impossible existence. It is about the nature of time itself, about the meaning of human life, about the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. It is a story that forces us to confront our own mortality while daring us to imagine what it might mean to live beyond the normal span of human years. Whether Elias Mercer was real or legend, whether he still walks among us or passed into oblivion more than a century ago, his story continues to resonate because it touches upon questions that are fundamental to human existence. In seeking to understand his mystery, we seek to understand ourselves and our place in a universe that is far stranger and more wonderful than we might ever dare to imagine. The Ozark Mountains keep their secrets well, and among those secrets, the story of Elias Mercer remains one of the most compelling and unsettling. As long as there are those who wonder about the nature of time, about the possibility of transcending mortality, about the mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of human understanding, the tale of the man who never aged will continue to fascinate and disturb in equal measure. And perhaps, on some misty morning in the Arkansas mountains, when the fog clings to the hollows and the ancient trees whisper of things better left forgotten, a solitary figure might still be seen walking the old paths, unchanged by time, untouched by age, carrying within himself the accumulated weight of decades that have become centuries, forever searching for answers to questions that may have no earthly resolution. The mystery of Elias Mercer, the man who never aged, remains unsolved, and perhaps it always will. But in its very insolubility lies its power to continue challenging our understanding of reality, our assumptions about human nature, and our beliefs about what is possible in this strange and wondrous world we inhabit. As we close this investigation into one of America's most enduring mysteries, we are left not with answers, but with questions that echo through time itself. What does it mean to be human? What are the true boundaries of natural law? And in a universe full of wonders we have yet to understand, what other mysteries might be walking among us, waiting to challenge everything we think we know about the nature of existence itself? The story of Elias Mercer reminds us that the world is still full of wonders, still capable of surprising us, still holding secrets that science and reason have yet to unlock. And perhaps, in the end, that is the greatest mystery of all. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.